March 15, 1944, dawned cold and clear over the German countryside when Oberleutnant Franz Stigler spotted something that made his blood run cold. A formation of silver fighters streaked across the sky at 28,000 feet, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even at this distance. The dreaded Mustangs had arrived deep over the Reich, and the rules of aerial combat would never be the same again. For 3 years, the Luftwaffe had owned the skies over Germany, their Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters intercepting Allied bombers with devastating efficiency while remaining safely out of reach of escort fighters that lacked the range to penetrate this far inland. But now everything had changed. Stigler, a veteran with 28 confirmed victories, felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping up his spine as he watched the P51 Mustangs weaving protectively above the B-17 bomber stream. These American fighters had appeared over Berlin just 2 weeks earlier, shattering the myth of Fortress Germany's invulnerability. The psychological impact had been immediate and profound. Luftwaffe pilots who had grown accustomed to attacking lumbering bombers without serious fighter opposition now found themselves hunted by an adversary that could outrun, outmaneuver, and outlast them in their own airspace. The North American P51 Mustang represented a perfect marriage of American airframe design and British engine technology. Originally designed for the British Royal Air Force in 1940, the Mustang had initially proven disappointing with its Allison engine. But when British engineers mated the airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in 1942, they created what would become arguably the finest fighter aircraft of World War II. The result was a fighter with extraordinary range, blistering speed exceeding 440 miles per hour, and the ability to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,100 miles. According to accounts compiled in the official United States Army Air Force's historical study, The Army Air Forces in World War II, the introduction of long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51, marked the turning point in the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. This context, drawn from military historical archives, confirms what Luftwaffe pilots experienced firsthand in the deadly skies of early 1944. Stigler remembered the briefing from General Major Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, who had warned them about the Mustang's capabilities. Galland himself, a legendary ace with 104 confirmed victories, had flown against the new American fighter and emerged deeply troubled. The Mustang possessed a combination of speed, range, maneuverability, and firepower that left German fighters at a severe disadvantage. Its .650 caliber machine guns could shred a Messerschmitt in seconds, and its laminar flow wing gave it performance characteristics that German engineers could barely comprehend. Now, as Stigler's Staffel climbed to intercept, he knew they faced an almost impossible task. The bombers they sought to destroy were protected by fighters that could stay with them throughout the entire mission. The Luftwaffe's strategy of conserving fuel by waiting until escorts turned back had become obsolete overnight. Every interception now meant facing the Mustangs, and the attrition rate among German pilots had begun climbing dramatically. Young replacement pilots, hastily trained with barely 100 hours of flight time, were being thrown into combat against American pilots with twice that experience and far superior equipment. It was slaughter, and every veteran knew it. The tactical advantages of the P-51 Mustang extended far beyond its impressive specifications. Major Hans-Joachim Marseille, before his death in 1942, had pioneered deflection shooting techniques that gave Luftwaffe pilots an edge in combat. But by early 1944, those advantages had evaporated against the Mustang's versatility. Oberleutnant Gunther Raoul, who would survive the war with 275 victories, later explained that fighting the Mustang required perfect execution with zero margin for error. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the silver fighters would be on you like wolves. The mathematics of aerial combat had shifted decisively in favor of the Americans. The P-51 could cruise at speeds that forced German fighters to constantly use fuel-consuming maximum power settings just to maintain contact. This meant Luftwaffe interceptors arrived at the combat area already depleted of fuel, while the Mustangs maintained ample reserves. In a dogfight, fuel equals time and time equals life. German pilots found themselves breaking off promising attacks not because they were outfought, but because their fuel gauges showed empty tanks with the nearest friendly airfield still 100 miles away. Hauptmann Heinz Bauer, an ace with 220 victories, encountered his first Mustangs over Schweinfurt in February 1944. He later described the experience as fighting an opponent who possessed all the advantages simultaneously. The Mustang accelerated faster, climbed better at higher altitudes, dove without compressibility problems that plagued German fighters, and could turn inside a Messerschmitt in sustained combat. Most devastating of all, it could chase fleeing Luftwaffe fighters all the way back to their bases, shooting them down as they attempted to land when they were most vulnerable. The Mustang's Packard-built Merlin 61 engine produced 1,490 horsepower and utilized a two-stage supercharger that maintained performance at altitudes where German fighters struggled. At 30,000 feet, a P51 could outperform any production Luftwaffe fighter by a significant margin. This high-altitude superiority meant American escort fighters could establish air superiority above the bomber formations, forcing German interceptors to attack from below where the bombers' defensive guns were most effective. It created a deadly trap with no good options. Oberst Johann Steinhoff, commander of Jagdgeschwader 7, recognized immediately that the Luftwaffe faced an existential crisis. His unit flying the new Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter represented Germany's best hope for countering Allied air superiority, but jet production remained hopelessly inadequate. Meanwhile, hundreds of Mustangs poured from American factories every month. By March 1944, the 8th Air Force could dispatch over 1,000 heavy bombers, with 800 fighters providing escort, and the majority of those escorts were P-51s. The psychological dimension of combat against the Mustang devastated German morale as thoroughly as the physical losses. Young Luftwaffe pilots, many barely 20 years old, climbed into their fighters knowing they faced overwhelming odds. The experienced instructors who might have taught them advanced combat techniques were dead, scattered across the battlefields of Russia, North Africa, and now Germany itself. The veterans who remained, men like Stigler and Raoul, were exhausted from flying multiple sorties daily against an enemy who seemed to possess unlimited resources. Colonel Don Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, epitomized the aggressive American approach to escort duties. His unit had transitioned from Thunderbolts to Mustangs in February 1944, and Blakesley immediately took advantage of the P-51's range to hunt German fighters wherever they could be found. His famous order to never leave a bomber established the tactical doctrine that made the Mustang so effective. American fighters no longer merely reacted to German attacks, they sought out and destroyed Luftwaffe aircraft before they could threaten the bombers. The engineering sophistication of the P-51 Mustang revealed itself in countless details that collectively created an almost insurmountable advantage. Its laminar flow wing, designed by North American Aviation's chief engineer Edgar Schmude, reduced drag to levels German aerodynamicists had thought impossible. This single innovation gave the Mustang its exceptional range and speed. Where a Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustav required constant pilot attention to manage its sensitive controls, the Mustang flew smoothly and predictably, allowing pilots to focus on tactics and situational awareness rather than wrestling their aircraft. Lieutenant Walter Krupinski, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, first encountered a formation of Mustangs over Hanover in late March 1944. He attempted a classic bounce attack, diving from above with the sun behind him, but the American pilots spotted him early thanks to their excellent visibility from the Mustang's bubble canopy. Before Krupinski could close within firing range, 2 P-51s had reversed on him, their superior dive performance allowing them to cut off his escape route. Only desperate maneuvering and the intervention of his wingman saved his life that day. He landed shaking, fully aware that he had survived through luck rather than skill. The bubble canopy fitted to P-51D models beginning in mid-1943 provided American pilots with panoramic visibility that turned the tables on Luftwaffe bounce tactics. German fighters still relied on the older framed canopy design that created significant blind spots, particularly to the rear. In air combat, the pilot who spots his opponent first usually wins, and the Mustang's visibility gave American pilots crucial seconds of advantage in nearly every engagement. Those seconds translated directly into victory or survival. Technical intelligence reports that fell into German hands confirmed what Luftwaffe pilots experienced firsthand. The Mustang's armament of 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns with 1,800 rounds of ammunition provided devastating firepower and excellent ammunition capacity. While German fighters typically carried either machine guns or 20mm cannons, the Mustang's heavy machine guns offered the perfect compromise between hitting power and ammunition supply. A Messerschmitt pilot who missed his first pass often lacked the ammunition for a second attack, while Mustang pilots could engage multiple targets without worrying about running dry. Oberfeldwebel Heinz Nock, who flew with Jagdgeschwader 11 and would end the war with 33 victories, recorded in his diary the growing desperation among Luftwaffe pilots. Every morning brought another mission briefing where the odds seemed more impossible than the day before. The Americans kept coming, wave after wave of bombers protected by fighters that seemed invulnerable. Ground crews worked frantically to repair battle-damaged aircraft and prepare them for the next sortie, but the replacement rate could not keep pace with combat losses. By April 1944, pilot attrition had reached catastrophic levels. The drop tank technology that extended the Mustang's range represented another critical advantage. American fighters carried 2 108-gallon external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty or when entering combat. This effectively gave the P51 an operational radius exceeding 650 miles while retaining full combat performance. German fighters attempting to intercept at these ranges operated at the absolute limit of their capabilities, often forced to disengage just when combat was joined because their fuel states had become critical. This asymmetry meant Luftwaffe pilots fought at a permanent disadvantage, always worried about fuel while their opponents pressed attacks with abandon. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland fought a desperate, political battle within the Luftwaffe High Command to address the fighter crisis. He argued for concentrating resources on fighter production and pilot training while reducing the emphasis on bombers and ground attack aircraft. But Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal and commander of the Luftwaffe, refused to acknowledge the severity of the situation. Göring's increasingly delusional pronouncements about German fighter superiority created a disconnect between frontline reality and command decisions that sealed the fate of thousands of German pilots. April 7, 1944 brought a mission that would become legendary in both American and German aviation circles. The 8th Air Force launched over 600 heavy bombers against aircraft factories in central Germany, escorted by nearly 700 fighters with Mustangs predominating. Hauptmann Rolf Hermeken, leading elements of Jagdgeschwader 11, watched the massive aerial armada approaching and knew immediately that his group faced annihilation if they engaged conventionally. The sheer numerical superiority of the Americans had reached levels that made tactical victory impossible regardless of individual pilot skill. The Luftwaffe had developed various desperation tactics to counter the Mustang threat. Some units attempted concentrated attacks with overwhelming force, gathering 50 or more fighters for a single coordinated strike against the bombers. But the Mustangs, flying in flexible finger-four formations developed by the RAF and refined by American pilots, proved almost impossible to surprise. Their radios worked reliably, allowing rapid coordination and mutual support. German radios, plagued by interference and limited range, often failed at critical moments, leaving pilots isolated and vulnerable. Major Georg Peter Eder, an experienced ace with 78 victories, pioneered high-speed hit-and-run attacks that sought to minimize exposure to the Mustang escorts. His theory was that single fighters diving at maximum speed could blast through the fighter screen, make one firing pass at the bombers, and escape before the P-51s could react. In practice, this tactic achieved limited success and proved suicidally dangerous. The Mustang's excellent high-speed handling meant American pilots could follow German fighters through the dive and engage during the vulnerable pull-up phase. Eder himself was shot down twice attempting these attacks, barely surviving both encounters. The spring of 1944 witnessed the systematic destruction of the Jaguar's experienced pilot cadre. Men who had survived years of combat over Russia, the Mediterranean, and Western Europe fell in increasing numbers to the guns of American Mustang pilots. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Krinius, with 114 victories, was killed in combat with P51s over Wunstorf on August 8, 1944. Major Gunther Schack, with 174 victories, was shot down multiple times by Mustangs but miraculously survived. The attrition of such irreplaceable experience created a crisis that no amount of new aircraft production could solve. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the most successful Mustang pilots of the war, eventually achieving 24 aerial victories with 13 additional probables. His aggressive tactics emphasized pursuit and destruction rather than simple escort. Meyer's philosophy held that the best way to protect bombers was to eliminate the German fighters before they could attack. This approach transformed American escort operations from reactive defense to proactive offense, and Luftwaffe pilots paid the price in blood. The combat radius of the P51 Mustang meant that nowhere in Germany remained safe from American fighters. Previously, Luftwaffe units could withdraw to airfields deep in the Reich to rest and refit beyond the range of Allied fighters. By mid-1944, Mustangs ranged as far as Prague, Munich, and Vienna. German fighters being ferried from factories to operational units fell victim to roaming American fighters. Training flights were disrupted by sudden attacks from Mustangs that seemed to appear from nowhere. The Luftwaffe was being hunted to extinction in its own airspace. Oberst Walter Ossau, one of Germany's most successful fighter pilots with 123 victories and a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, met his end in combat with P51 Mustangs on May 11, 1944. His death symbolized the changing fortunes of the Luftwaffe. No amount of experience, skill, or courage could overcome the combination of numerical inferiority, fuel shortages, inferior equipment, and exhaustion that characterized German fighter operations by mid-war. The loss of such proven leaders created a leadership vacuum that could never be filled. The first large-scale American fighter escort mission to Berlin took place on March 6, 1944, and it shattered German illusions about homeland defense. Over 600 heavy bombers struck the German capital protected by 800 escort fighters, with P51 Mustangs providing the crucial long-range coverage. For Berliners who had endured years of RAF night bombing, the sight of American heavy bombers over the city in broad daylight, protected by swarms of silver fighters, delivered a devastating psychological blow. If the Luftwaffe could not defend the capital, what hope remained for Germany? Oberst Hans Trautloff, a veteran fighter leader with 57 victories who commanded Jagddivision I, understood immediately that the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented a turning point. In meetings with other senior Luftwaffe officers, he argued that Germany had already lost the air war and that the only question remaining was how long the agony would continue. His pessimism proved justified as mission after mission saw Luftwaffe fighters overwhelmed by numerically superior American forces flying superior equipment with adequate fuel and ammunition, advantages German pilots could only dream about. The Second Berlin mission on March 8, 1944 resulted in the highest single-day loss of Luftwaffe fighters in the war to that point. 66 German aircraft were destroyed, many falling to the guns of Mustang pilots who had been specifically trained to exploit the P-51's advantages. Among the dead was Hauptmann Egon Meyer, the renowned ace with 102 victories who had pioneered head-on attacks against heavy bombers. His death in combat with P-51s over Malmedy symbolized the shift in air combat dynamics. The old tactics no longer worked, and the pilots who had perfected them were dying. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 355th Fighter Group achieved a remarkable feat on October 7, 1944, when his P-51 shot down two Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighters, the Luftwaffe's revolutionary new weapon. The jets were theoretically untouchable, with speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour, but Drew caught them during their vulnerable takeoff phase. This tactical development forced the Luftwaffe to divert increasingly scarce resources to airfield defense, further reducing the already inadequate fighter forces available to defend against bomber streams. The Mustang had effectively neutralized even Germany's most advanced technology. The establishment of American tactical air forces in France, following the Normandy invasion in June 1944, created an impossible situation for the Luftwaffe. German fighters attempting to oppose the invasion faced attacks from multiple directions by fresh Allied squadrons. The P51 units based in England continued their deep penetration escort missions while 9th Air Force Mustangs operating from forward bases in France hunted German aircraft at low altitude. Luftwaffe pilots faced the nightmarish prospect of being attacked from above by strategic escorts and from below by tactical fighters, often simultaneously. Lieutenant Heinz Marquardt of Jagdgeschwader 3 survived being shot down by Mustangs on 4 separate occasions between March and June 1944. Each time he managed to bail out or crash land his damaged fighter, and each time he returned to combat more convinced that the war was lost. His diary entries from this period, preserved in German military archives, document the grinding psychological toll of sustained combat against superior forces. Many entries end with lists of friends killed that day, the names growing longer as spring turned to summer. By August, half the pilots in his unit were dead or missing. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group became one of the most celebrated American fighter pilots of the war with 21 8/10 confirmed aerial victories, most achieved while flying the P51 Mustang. His aggressive combat style and exceptional marksmanship made him legendary among both American and German pilots. Gentile's success demonstrated that the Mustang in the hands of a skilled pilot became an almost unstoppable weapon. His techniques were studied and emulated throughout the fighter groups, creating a generation of American pilots who maximized the P-51's potential, while German pilots struggled with obsolescent equipment and inadequate training. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe had abandoned any pretense of strategic air defense in favor of desperate last stands. Generalmajor Dietrich Peltz, commanding officer of 2nd Fighter Corps, organized mass formations of up to 300 fighters for single concentrated attacks against bomber streams. These Großeinsatz or maximum effort missions represented the Luftwaffe's last hope of inflicting unacceptable losses on the Americans. But even these massive formations proved vulnerable to the Mustang escorts that tore into them before they could reach the bombers, breaking up the carefully planned attacks and leaving German fighters scattered and vulnerable. The introduction of the North American P-51H model in early 1945 brought even more advanced capabilities to the battlefield. With an uprated engine producing 2,000 horsepower and improved aerodynamics, this variant could exceed 480 miles per hour in level flight and featured better, high-altitude performance than any operational German fighter. Fortunately for the remaining Luftwaffe pilots, only 60 P-51H aircraft reached operational units before the war ended. The standard P-51D model had already proven more than adequate for achieving total air superiority over Germany. Major Wilhelm Batz, who achieved 237 victories and survived the war, later recalled that by late 1944, Luftwaffe fighter pilots were essentially flying suicide missions. New pilots arriving at operational units with barely 100 hours total flight time were expected to engage. American fighters flown by combat veterans with 500 or more hours experience. The resulting slaughter was predictable and tragic. Some young pilots were shot down on their first mission, never even seeing the enemy that killed them. The few who survived more than 10 missions were considered veterans and pressed into leadership roles for which they were completely unprepared. Operation Bodenplatte, launched on January 1, 1945, represented the Luftwaffe's final major offensive action in the West. Nearly 1,000 German fighters attacked Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland, hoping to destroy Allied air power on the ground. While the attacks achieved some initial success, destroying or damaging nearly 500 Allied aircraft, the Luftwaffe lost 300 fighters and 292 pilots, including many irreplaceable unit commanders and experienced leaders. Allied production replaced their losses within days, while the Luftwaffe never recovered from this self-inflicted catastrophe. Mustang units that survived the initial surprise rapidly regrouped and exacted terrible revenge over the following weeks. The final months of the war saw Mustang pilots ranging freely across Germany, attacking targets of opportunity with near impunity. Trains, vehicles, airfields, even individual soldiers became targets for the marauding American fighters. Oberst Johann Steinhoff's attempt to organize jet fighter units into an effective force came too late and with too few aircraft. The Me-262 Schwalbe could outrun any Allied fighter, but it required extensive ground infrastructure, highly trained maintenance crews, and reliable fuel supplies, all of which had become impossible to guarantee by early 1945. Captain Chuck Yeager, who would later become the first pilot to break the sound barrier, achieved 11.5 aerial victories while flying Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group. His combat reports document the complete air superiority enjoyed by American fighters by war's end. Yeager described missions where entire German fighter formations would refuse combat, diving away at maximum speed the moment they spotted Mustangs. The legendary aggression of Luftwaffe fighter pilots had been beaten out of them through years of losses against an enemy they could not defeat. The final recorded aerial combat between a P51 Mustang and a Luftwaffe fighter occurred on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. Lieutenant Hilton Thompson of the 359th Fighter Group shot down a Focke-Wulf FW-190 attempting to escape to neutral Sweden. With that final victory, the Mustang's combat record against the Luftwaffe stood complete. American P-51 pilots had destroyed thousands of German aircraft, established absolute air supremacy over the Reich, and directly contributed to shortening the war by enabling the strategic bombing campaign to continue unabated. The statistical record of the air war over Germany tells a story of systematic destruction. Between January and May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,000 fighters in combat with American forces, with Mustang pilots claiming approximately 60% of these victories. But behind every number stood a human being, a young man who had dreamed of becoming a pilot, who had trained for months or years, and who died violently in the skies above his homeland. The Mustang's effectiveness came at a terrible price paid by German fighter pilots, many of them teenagers barely old enough to understand what they were fighting for. Unteroffizier Karl-Heinz Weber joined Jagdgeschwader 54 in March 1944 at age 18 with exactly 103 hours of flight time. He survived exactly 13 days before being shot down by Mustangs during his 6th combat mission. He managed to bail out but was severely burned and spent the remainder of the war in hospital. His experience was tragically typical. Of the 22 pilots who completed training with him, only 4 survived the war. The Mustang had created a meat grinder that consumed an entire generation of German youth. The American pilots who flew the P-51 Mustang were not immune to the psychological toll of combat. Captain Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, who achieved 27 victories, later described the strange mixture of exhilaration and horror that accompanied aerial combat. Each victory meant a human being had died, often in flames or after a terrifying plunge from high altitude. Some American pilots struggled with the ethics of shooting, parachuting enemy pilots, a practice that was officially prohibited but occasionally occurred in the heat of battle. The Mustang's effectiveness did not eliminate the fundamental brutality of war. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, whose encounter with a crippled B-17 bomber became famous through the book A Higher Call, represented the best traditions of military aviation. Despite having opportunities to destroy the damaged bomber, he chose to escort it to safety, recognizing the humanity of his enemies. His decision stood in sharp contrast to the increasingly desperate and brutal conduct of the air war by late 1944. The presence of the Mustang had forced such desperation that some Luftwaffe units resorted to ramming attacks, sacrificing their own lives to destroy a single bomber. The families of German fighter pilots lived with constant dread, knowing that every mission might be the last. Ilse Bauer, wife of Ace Heinz Bauer, later recalled the strain of watching her husband depart for combat multiple times daily, never knowing if he would return. The doorbell ringing unexpectedly could mean notification of death. The telegraph arriving might bring the dreaded message every military family feared. The efficiency of the Mustang as a weapon translated directly into grief for hundreds of German households, communities destroyed by the loss of their finest young men. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group achieved 26 and 8/10 aerial victories before being killed by friendly anti-aircraft fire on Christmas Day 1944. His death illustrated that even the most successful fighter pilots faced constant danger from multiple sources. The Mustang provided significant advantages but could not guarantee survival. Every sortie brought new risks, and even the slightest error or misfortune could prove fatal. The air war consumed pilots from both sides with an appetite that seemed impossible to satisfy. The medical facilities in Germany were overwhelmed with injured fighter pilots by late 1944. Severe burns, shrapnel wounds, broken bones from parachute landings, and psychological trauma filled hospital wards across the Reich. Many pilots who survived being shot down faced months of recovery before returning to combat if they ever did. The Mustang's 650 caliber machine guns inflicted horrific wounds, and pilots who survived hits often carried permanent disabilities. The human cost of the air war extended far beyond simple mortality statistics. Oberstleutnant Gunther Lutzow, a distinguished ace with 108 victories and a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, disappeared on April 24, 1945 during combat with American fighters near Donauwörth. His body was never recovered. His fate remained unknown for decades, one more among thousands of Luftwaffe pilots who simply vanished into the sky. The Mustang had created such carnage that identifying and recovering all the dead became impossible. Many families waited years for closure that never came.